What was the first submarine to ever sink an enemy ship in combat? A reasonable guess would be a German U-boat during World War I. But the truth is, the first effective war submarine was deployed a full 50 years before World War I, during the American Civil War. The HL Hunley was a 40-foot iron submarine, a steampunk fever dream, lit inside by candlelight and powered by hand cranks. For 136 years, the Hunley and her final crew lay buried in the waters off Charleston, South Carolina, as the world on land drastically changed. But as it turns out, the Hunley was not gone forever. How they found the Hunley, how they brought her eerie tomb to the surface, and what and who they found sealed inside, is what we're here to discover today.
Do you not like deep water, claustrophobia, darkness? Well, you're not going to like this.
Let's start at the beginning of the end for the Hunley submarine. It was the night of February 17, 1864. Robert Fleming was standing watch aboard the USS Housatonic, an over 200-foot-long Union ship stationed at the mouth of Charleston Harbor. Fleming was one of about 50 black soldiers aboard the Housatonic, choosing to fight for the Union despite the added violence and danger he faced if he were to be captured by Confederate forces. As Fleming gazed across the calm water toward Fort Sumter, he saw what appeared to be a log in the water. And this log seemed to be moving against the current, not with it, toward the Housatonic. Fleming alerted his supervisor to the mysterious log, convinced it was one of the legendary fish boats they had been warned to look out for. The Union Navy knew the Confederates were cooking up some sort of stealth torpedo boat. They just didn't know when it was coming. "It's a log," his superior said, and told Fleming to go back to his lookout. Up on the quarterdeck, acting shipsmaster John Crosby saw the same log, what looked to him like a porpoise coming to the surface to blow. The strange porpoise was 100 yards off starboard. It didn't take him long to realize this was no log, this was no porpoise. The Housatonic was in trouble. Let's face it, we don't associate the American Civil War with submarine warfare. I mean, we don't associate the American Civil War with camel warfare either, but they had a US Camel Corps. That is, until the camels got cranky and just wandered off. But during the war, from 1861 to 1865, both sides wanted to try out a submarine. In fact, Americans have been messing around with submarines since at least the American Revolution. Europeans, even before that. The Dutch inventor and occultist Cornelius Drebbel built a submersible craft that swam around the Thames in the 1620s. It couldn't do all that much by our modern submersible standards, but legend has it that King James I took a ride in it. I would not have done that if I were him. In 1776, yes, that 1776.
Vote for independence!
Is that Mr. Feeney? David Bushnell created the Turtle, an egg-shaped submarine designed to attach explosives on the hulls of enemy ships, a foreshadowing of how the Hunley would operate.
You have created what men have dreamt of, an underwater craft that is practical and safe.
Bushnell was like, "Hello, General George Washington, I made this. It's called the Turtle. Do you want it for war?" Remember when Elon Musk offered to build the Thai cave rescue team, quote, basically a tiny kid-sized submarine, and then did build it and brought it to Thailand, and they told him, "This has no chance of working." Similar situation here. Even though George Washington believed Bushnell was a genius, he said, "We're not putting the new nation's hands in your weird little war submarine, sir." But almost 100 years later, there was a new war on American soil, being fought between the North and South primarily for control over the expansion of slavery. New prototype submarines were being built, at least 25 that came before the Hunley. Here's one you can still find today, decaying on a beach in Panama. Long story. But the Hunley was the first to ever complete a successful mission to take out an enemy warship. That distinction is all hers. Why was the Hunley different? To answer those questions, let's go all the way back to 1861, the start of the war, and the opportunity that knocked on the door of 37-year-old Horace Lawson Hunley. The Confederate Navy was vastly undermatched as compared to the Union Navy, so the Confederacy turned to privately designed and owned ships. The South sent out a call saying, "Our ports are blockaded. Anyone who can build us something that sinks Union ships and breaks the blockade can make $50,000, well over $1 million in today's money." This is where Horace Hunley came in. Hunley was a man who had access to money and ambition in abundance. He was sort of an Elon Musk character, really, and not just because he also built a tiny submarine. Hunley had a proto-Silicon Valley type of vibe. He did daily affirmations, logged all his activities, feared procrastination, and wanted to be seen as a great man through technology, invention, and wealth. So in 1861, Hunley got together with New Orleans machine shop owners James McClintock and Baxter Watson, who actually had the needed engineering skills, to work to create their first fishboat to operate for the Confederacy. The men built a submersible craft that was 34 feet long, 4 feet wide, and 4 feet tall. It was dubbed the Pioneer.
This is the Pioneer, which was the first submarine the two men built out of an old iron boiler. The small crew would be completely shut up inside in darkness with only a compass and a barometer to guide them, even though the compass didn't work that well because they're inside an iron tube. The Pioneer performed pretty well in tests, but then New Orleans fell to Union forces, so they just had to get rid of it. They had to scuttle it and move on to submarine number 2.
If you thought this adorable story about plucky sub-builders wouldn't get grim, you've never read anything about the American Civil War. It's difficult to fully confirm, but it's believed that 2 of the earliest test pilots of the Pioneer were enslaved men. With no proper training, they got stuck in the mud, underwater, and suffocated. If this is true, they wouldn't be the last to die in Hunley's quest for greatness. After they had to sink Pioneer, Hunley and McClintock left for Mobile, Alabama to continue their work. Construction began on what would be dubbed Pioneer 2 and then eventually the American Diver. Even though she was still constructed from an old boiler, the Diver was bigger, sleeker, and faster than the Pioneer. She also sank. They all sank. But third time's a charm, and in July of 1863, a brand new submarine, built from the ground up, that is, not out of an old boiler, was unveiled. This was the submarine dubbed Fishboat, that was 40 feet long, had room for a crew of 8, and was miles ahead of any naval weapon ever built. Fishboat, which would become the HL Hunley, had keel weights that could be dropped for buoyancy. She had portals that could be covered for more stealth. The captain would sit below the forward conning tower, where he could see out, and steer the Hunley with a joystick-like tiller. The first officer was stationed aft, at the back of the crew compartment, cranking, and also handling the ballast tank pump. She even had a snorkel system that never really worked, but hey, did your pre-Civil War submarine even have a snorkel system? No.
This is a hand crank simulator of what it would have been like to be inside the Hunley. I am 6'1", which is the same height as the tallest crew member, and this is bigger and a more airy replica than the Hunley actually would have been, and it's already so claustrophobic in here. Imagine being with 7 other men along this portside bench. It's dark, every breath is precious.
If something went wrong, the only exit was through a 20-inch wide hatch on either conning tower. Could you squeeze through that? My hips don't lie, and they say I might be going down with the ship. After the Hunley successfully sank a barge during tests in Mobile Bay, she was called to Charleston, South Carolina to take on the blockade of Union ships that were choking the city. If the Hunley could sink a Union ship, she would earn a hefty paycheck. Charleston, by this time, was a shell of its former glory. Most of the population had to flee, and even those that stayed were being starved and constantly bombarded for going on 600 days. When this secret weapon arrived in Charleston, General Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard, tell me you're a Confederate general without telling me you're a Confederate general, was the commander of Charleston. Remember how Hunley and McClintock were going to sell their submarine to the Confederates for big money? Well, instead, Beauregard was like, yoink, this is ours now, and just seized the whole submarine, crewing her with volunteers from the Confederate forces. McClintock, her builder, warned Lieutenant John Payne, the new commander of the Hunley, that while she looked simple enough to operate, she wasn't. They ignored him, and McClintock left Charleston a bitter man, never to see his creation again. Maybe someone should have listened to McClintock because, surprise, it did not go well. Content warning, claustrophobia, waterphobia, sea phobia, submarine phobia. During a test, the Hunley fell beneath the waves and water came rushing in. Somehow Lieutenant Payne was able to escape out the rear hatch. Charles Hasker, a crew member, hauled himself through the rising water, barreling in from the hatch, only to have the top of the hatch slam down, pinning Hasker halfway out of the sub. The Hunley finally hit the bottom of the harbor. Hasker got mostly free, but then the hatch closed on his leg. Finally, the pressure inside the fishboat equalized, and Hasker somehow managed to swim 42 feet through black water to the surface. 5 men died that day, sunk with the Hunley. Payne, Hasker, and another crewman escaped through the rear hatch. Understandably, those 3 survivors wanted nothing to do with the Hunley ever again. Hasker later said, "I was the only man that went to the bottom with the fishboat and came up to tell the tale." Soldiers started calling her the Iron Coffin, which, it's a fair name. Hunley, the man, not the submarine, arrives in Charleston and is like, what? No applause? He had hoped the Hunley was already out there sinking Union ships left and right. Instead, he finds out his submarine is sunk with 5 dead men in it. He writes to General Beauregard like, "All right, Confederacy, if you give me the submarine back, we'll use our own private crew." Beauregard agrees, and soon the Hunley is raised from the water. But the bodies are still in there and have to be cleaned out of the fishboat. The 5 men who died inside the Hunley were found caught between the bench and the crank, their bodies, quote, "so swollen and offensive." Because of their time in the warm Charleston waters, their bodies were waterlogged and bloated to the point they had to be forcibly dismembered in order to even fit them through the narrow hatches. Even after the dismemberment, Lieutenant Payne had to special order extra-large coffins. But in the late summer of 1863, the horrifying smell and state of the Hunley did not deter Horace Hunley. He scrubbed away the stench and reached out to the men who built her in Mobile to send a crew, the rightful crew in all their minds, to Charleston. It's a rainy morning in October of 1863, and Horace Hunley is here at the wharf for the Hunley's redemption arc. He's going to show people just how remarkable and reliable and totally not a death trap the Hunley actually is. Hunley intends to pilot the fishboat himself out into the harbor with a crew of 7 additional men. As a demonstration, they would charge the anchored ship, the Indian Chief, dive under it, and resurface on the other side. This will not only be a crowd pleaser, it will also prove that Hunley is ready to do the same thing in battle. So the Hunley moves across the water towards the Indian Chief and dives underneath it. Bubbles roil on the surface where she dove. The crew on the Indian Chief cheers. The public here on the shore cheers. This is all so exciting. But all that bubbling, that's actually a bad sign. The Hunley is supposed to be stealth. She should have disappeared without a trace. Below the water, the Hunley and the crew desperately tried to make the Hunley surface, but her bow was buried in the mud, the ship frozen at a 45-degree angle. It was the seacock. In his excitement, Hunley had forgotten to close the seacock, a valve that would make it possible to pump water out of the forward ballast tank. Water flooded much of the main compartment, and 6 of the 8 crewmen died within minutes. 2 of the men, including Hunley, would be found in the hatchways, presumably trying to open the hatch covers. their heads bobbing just above the water, their breathing and heart rate skyrocketing, unable to open the hatch. Both men died a slow death by asphyxiation. All of the crew either drowned or asphyxiated. I warned you, tales from early submarine technology are not pleasant. Despite all the chaos underwater, the newspaper headline the following day read only, "Melancholy occurrence. On Thursday morning, an accident occurred on a small boat in the Cooper River, containing 8 persons, all of whom were drowned." The Hunley was, once again, recovered on November 7th after sitting in silt under 60 feet of water for weeks. Inside the submarine, well, this is what General Beauregard had to say about the scene. "When the boat was discovered, raised and opened, the spectacle was indescribable and ghastly. The unfortunate men were contorted into all kinds of horrible attitudes, some clutching candles, evidently endeavoring to force open the manholes, others lying in the bottom tightly grappled together, and the blackened faces of all presented the expression of their despair and agony." Horace Hunley was given a military funeral, even though he was not an officer or even an enlisted man. A lock of hair was sent to Horace's sister Volumnia, whose plea for him to not, under any circumstances, try to captain the submarine himself had come too late. Was Horace Lawson Hunley a great man? At the time, he was more of a Dr. Frankenstein, dying at the hands of his own dark creation. General Beauregard said of the Hunley submarine, "It is more dangerous to those who use it than the enemy." It is here we meet George Dixon, a man dandily dressed, probably originally from the North. He was a worker at the shop that built the Hunley. He had served under General Beauregard at Shiloh and came to Charleston to convince the general to let him have one final chance with the Hunley. While the Hunley was scrubbed clean, again, a process that would take 21 pounds of soap and 3 weeks, Dixon recruited a new crew, mainly from the CSS Indian Chief. This was truly a ragtag group of volunteers, the bad news boaters. The third and final Hunley crew included a Union prisoner who decided to change sides, several Europeans, and a man we know only by the name Lumpkin, like Cher. General Beauregard told Dixon that every man had to know exactly what they were getting into. The Hunley would require claustrophobic spaces, 12-hour days of hard physical labor, lots of practice, and remember, the boat had already killed 2 crews. At least they enjoyed a lifestyle far better than the typical Confederate, wrote Brian Hicks in his book Sea of Darkness. And the truth was, their chance of death was really not all that much greater. Dixon, Alexander, and the new Team Hunley got to work refitting the submarine and testing her out around Sullivan's Island. They worked together, lived together in an abandoned house, trained together like some sort of grim real-world cast. They would train at night, sneaking up on Union ships so close they could silently creak open the rear hatch and hear singing and voices as they lurked nearby. By February of 1864, they had their Union target in mind, the USS Housatonic, a 207-foot-long screw sloop powered by a steam engine and equipped with 12 cannons. The Housatonic, stationed at the mouth of Charleston Harbor, was part of the blockade strangling Charleston. She tended to anchor very close to shore, which made her a perfect target for the Hunley. On February 17th, the still only 24-year-old Lieutenant George Dixon stood on the moonlit shore of Sullivan's Island holding his $20 gold coin. 2 years prior, at the Battle of Shiloh, the coin had saved his life when it stopped a bullet that would have killed him. The coin still carried the dent to prove it. The coin is in Dixon's hand as he rubs it for luck, placing it in his back pocket when he boards the Hunley. Call it conviction, faith, naivete, but George Dixon believed the Hunley, this secret submarine, would work. From the moment Robert Fleming saw the moving log, everything happened quickly. The crew of the Housatonic watched helplessly as the submarine moved steadily closer and closer. The captain told the crew to open fire, but by then the Hunley was too close for the ship's main deck guns to be able to hit it. The Hunley, her iron spar at a slightly downward angle, a torpedo with 135 pounds of black powder at the end, made contact with the Housatonic. There was no loud boom. The first thing the crew noticed was a tremor through her wooden planks, and then the ship seemed to stagger, listing to port. Shards of wood fell down on the crew, and the ship's engine room began to flood. Black smoke billowed from her rear flank where she was hit, and a sulfur smell filled the air. The Housatonic was going down. A nearby Union ship came to pluck her men from the frigid Charleston waters, but 5 men would die in her sinking. We can't know exactly what happened to the submarine that night. Perhaps the men purposely traveled further out to sea to avoid being seen by the other Union ships. They may have come to rest at the bottom of the harbor and then misjudged how much oxygen they actually had, slowly asphyxiating. Or perhaps the Hunley was too close to the Housatonic when the explosion occurred, tearing holes in the hull. Or, as a new theory suggested, shock waves caused their immediate deaths, and the crew just continued to sink and drift until they hit bottom, already corpses. What we do know is that after the sinking of the Housatonic, the Hunley disappeared beneath the dark Charleston water, never to rise again of her own power. And there, somewhere at the bottom of the sea, is where the Hunley and her crew would rest for 136 years. Charleston fell. The Confederacy fell. Another century passed, and all the while, the Hunley waited patiently. Until one day, in the mid-1990s, along came American adventure novelist Clive Cussler? If you don't know who Clive Cussler is, you're obviously not a fan of Dirk Pitt.
I'm looking for a boat.
Pacific Vortex? Night Probe? Raise the Titanic? Anyone? Ask your uncle. Or my dad. He knows. After striking it rich with his Dirk Pitt books in the 1970s, Cussler, an expert diver in his own right, set his sights on finding the Hunley, beginning the search in 1980. Over the next decade and a half, Cussler would devote countless hours and funds finding the missing fishboat.
It was a good ship, a cussed ship.
I think it's cool that Clive had this obsessive, expensive, extremely high-level hobby. At first, Cussler and his team searched around the wreck of the Housatonic. The Hunley was thought to be nearby or even tangled up in her wreck. But they found no submarine anywhere near the Union wreckage. The team used electronic scanners to pick over 16 square miles of the seafloor around Charleston, but still, no Hunley. Cussler feared she had been swept out to sea. Meanwhile, as Cussler's search for the Hunley and her third crew continued, there was a little issue with her very first crew. This is Randy Burbage, a Civil War reenactor. In 1983, he was researching what happened to the first Hunley crew, buried in the Seamen's Burial Ground. He discovered that in 1947, the Charleston City Council decided to build a football stadium on top of what was the Seamen's Burial Ground and the burial ground for a home of widows and orphans. I'm sorry, sailors, widows, and orphans. I hope you like football. It's a tale as old as time, unfortunately. Burbage found that while the headstones of the dead had been moved, the actual dead had not.
You only moved the headstones!
So Burbage and his pals from the Confederate Heritage Trust go to the football stadium parking lot and started digging. Then they obtain permission to excavate under the stadium bleachers, and the archaeologists find almost 24 graves, 4 of which belong to the first Hunley crew. If you recall, the bodies from the first Hunley crew were so bloated when the submarine was raised that they had to be hacked apart to get them out. They also needed extra large coffins. Excavating under the stadium, those bigger coffins were hard to miss. And inside those extra large coffins, archaeologists found limbs placed next to or lying across rib cages, and the bones themselves revealed sawing that took place to get them out of the submarine. The coffins were also stacked on top of one another, indicative of a speedy burial, so word of the Hunley would not reach Union spies. But only 4 Hunley crew members had been found. Where was the 5th crew member? Some believe, though it's difficult to fully confirm, that the 5th Hunley crew member, Absalom Williams, was a free black man, buried separately and found later. The 5 crew members were eventually laid to rest at the Magnolia Cemetery, beside the 2nd Hunley crew and Horace Hunley himself. So that's the 1st and 2nd crew buried in Magnolia. But by 1995, the final crew and the Hunley herself had yet to be located. On May 3, 1995, boat captain Ralph Wilbanks, Wes Hall, and diver Harry Pecorelli set out for what felt like another possibly futile Hunley hunt on Clive Cussler's dime. Pecorelli dove on a potential target, 1,000 feet out to sea from the wreck of the Housatonic. Even though he felt something smooth underneath the sand, he didn't believe it could be the Hunley. But Wilbanks and Hall were not ready to admit defeat. Hall dove down with Pecorelli and, using only his hands in the low visibility, examined the object. At first, he thought it was an old boiler. And then he came upon something boilers don't have: a hinge. When Hall surfaced, he said, "It's the Hunley. That's it. That's all it can be." After over 130 years, the Hunley had been found. Okay, so Cussler's team had found her, but who did the Hunley belong to? The Navy, South Carolina, and Alabama all believed they had the claim. There were rumors the Smithsonian wanted the Hunley too. As for Cussler, he wasn't telling anyone where she was until there was a plan to prevent looters and treasure hunters from trying to get a piece of the Hunley. At first, the Navy seemed to have the upper hand against the states because they had claim on all Confederate ships. But South Carolina was like, "Hey Navy, remember, the Hunley was never a Confederate ship. Sure, the Confederacy seized her briefly, but she was a privateer vessel, as in for money, profit." Negotiations went on for months. Cussler, ever the adventure writer, wrote, "The vultures came to rest like gargoyles brooding over a derelict cathedral. Everyone wanted a piece of the action, and they began fighting over the Hunley, like a school of piranha, attacking a ham tossed off the stern of a riverboat." Finally, a deal was struck, and in November of 1995, Cussler turned over the coordinates to the Naval Historical Center in Washington. The Hunley belonged to the U.S. government, but her forever home would be in Charleston. But what now? Raise it seemed like the obvious answer, because it would be picked apart by looters otherwise. But how do you raise a 130-year-old submarine? You can't just go yanking a 100-plus-year-old ship out of the muck, like the USS Cairo. The poor USS Cairo. The Cairo, a Union ironclad, was sunk by a mine in 1862 near Vicksburg, Mississippi. In the 1960s, preserved by the river mud, the Cairo was bursting with artifacts, a historical treasure trove. A salvage crew wrapped a 3-inch cable around her hull and attempted to pull the 512-ton ship out of the mud. The cables cut through her, quote, like a hot knife through butter. The Cairo's guts were ripped open, pouring her contents into the river. They pulled her out in 3 pieces and left her to dry in the sun. Within a year, she had practically rotted away. They had to raise the Hunley correctly, or this singular creation would very likely be destroyed. But how? A massive frame and cradle were made for the sub. Divers would swim down and bolt a strap to one side of the truss, burrow underneath the sub, and then attach the strap to the other side of the truss, creating a sling. Each strap had a bag with an opening at the top that would be filled with a polyurethane foam, froth pack. The froth pack would expand and harden within 40 seconds underwater, protecting the Hunley's hull in essentially a molded foam cushion. In August of 2000, the Carlissa B, a gigantic barge with 6 legs that could plant into the ocean floor, hauled the Hunley off the seabed, held in this cradle sling foam contraption. On August 8th at 8:39 a.m., the HL Hunley slowly emerged from the water for the first time in 136 years. After a slow crawl through Charleston, she was brought to her new home. Here she is today, the HL Hunley.
The water is so clear. Probably not like the water in Charleston Harbor.
She lives at the old Charleston Naval Base, the location of the Hunley Lab, where she has been since the day she was pulled from the water. The Hunley, and presumably her crew, had come back from battle. Now it was time to see what she had to say. This is Clemson University maritime archaeologist Nick DeLong. We had to give Nick our camera to go behind the barriers to film for us, because the Hunley is currently floating in sodium hydroxide to prevent any further corrosion or crumbling. The sodium hydroxide solution is so dangerous that even after they drain the tank to work on the ship, the archaeologists still have to wear PPE, Tyvek suits, and respirators. Okay, but what is a maritime archaeologist?
We study archaeology much like any terrestrial archaeologist would. It's just really our environment that's different. So we've excavated, large shipwrecks, the Hunley, for example, in conditions where visibility was somewhere between, a couple of feet and absolutely nothing, so pitch black.
After arriving at the lab for 6 months, the Hunley sat in her tank. Everyone was desperate to get a look inside her hull, but opening her up would not be simple.
It was full to the brim with sediment. So one of the first things that they had to do when they brought the sub into this tank was figure out exactly how they wanted to excavate the interior.
They decided to remove 3 250-pound plates from the sub. The sediment inside her hull held solid and didn't topple out like a gutted game animal, as was feared might happen. The sludge had, quote, the consistency of raw cookie dough. If you're an archaeologist, you want the bones, you want the remains, you want the artifacts.
Yes.
You want them quickly, you want to see what's in there, but you have to do it over a course of years.
It takes a very long time. And you're right, we want to get inside, we want to study the artifacts, we want to get the human remains and all of that kind of stuff, but at the same time, we study the Hunley itself as a functioning artifact. What allowed it to accomplish its mission, all those kind of things. So we take a look at it in a very kind of organic way, both, the relationship between the sub itself and the artifacts within.
That makes so much sense, that it's not just like,
right.
It's not
just a box to open, it's artifact in and of itself.
After 2 weeks of excavating, they found the crew's bench on the port side, but still no sign of the crew themselves. They found buttons, pipes, a wallet, and clumps of their clothing, material that Nick is still working on to this day. He took me back into the on-site Clemson University lab to look at the block lifts, essentially chunks of sediment removed from inside the submarine and slowly excavated.
One of my main projects has been the study excavation of the textiles recovered from the Hunley submarine.
And this is not from the Hunley.
This is from the Hunley.
Oh, it is?
Yes.
Oh.
This is from the Hunley.
What do you think this would be?
It looks like it's wool, so it's probably a section from somebody's jacket or pants.
This is so cool. This is somehow just as powerful a reach through time as human bones are, in a way.
I couldn't agree with you more. It's definitely, that was on somebody who participated in an extremely historic event. One of the main reasons to keep it in water is this stuff is so fragile and so degraded that the water column itself actually helps hold it all together. So if you were to take it out of the water and try and excavate it, there's a strong chance that it would just collapse.
Back in March of 2001, Maria Jacobson was finally able to climb inside the Hunley. She has the distinction of being the first person to enter the sub since 1864. The air inside choked her. It reeked of sulfur and rotting things from the ocean. But she stayed and continued digging. Below the snorkel box, a foot down into the muck, she found something. she gingerly moved away the years of sediment to find what appeared to be a human rib. The rib belonged to a young man of about 19 or 20. His body was propped up under the snorkel box, frozen in time. From there, they located 6 crew members within only a few weeks. So many tiny, fragile bones in the mud. Within a month, they had found their first skull. Finding skulls inside the Hunley was a big deal, as it would allow for better identification and reconstruction of each man's facial features, but also might give clues as to how they died. The skulls of the Hunley crew were found near the floor. They decomposed and toppled from the necks of their owners, whose bodies were slumped but in upright positions. Unlike the first 2 crews of the Hunley, where the bodies were found contorted in the tiny sub, the skeletons on the 3rd crew looked almost peaceful. They seemed to have died at their posts. The team soldiered on, finding 7 skulls by May. Inside each skull, intact brains were found. More fascinating science, but nobody was getting buried until all the remains were found. Notably absent was George Dixon, the leader of the Hunley. On May 17th, that question was finally answered. The remains of Lieutenant George Dixon were found under the forward conning tower, slumped just like his crewmates. His skull was intact and showed no signs of trauma. With Dixon found, a funeral and burial could finally happen. As Maria Jacobson, the archaeologist, felt under Dixon's remains, making sure the metal sheet for the block lift was placed correctly, she felt something. Her face went blank. Do you remember Dixon's gold coin? His lucky gold piece, the one that stopped the bullet at Shiloh? I bet you $100 this is it, she said. She pulled her hand out of the muck and rinsed it with water. In her hand was George Dixon's lucky gold piece. He'd kept it with him all these years. And they didn't even know this, but on the back of the coin was inscribed, Shiloh, April 6, 1862. My life preserver, G.E.D. Now that they had the 8 skulls, each crewman's face was reconstructed. A cast was made of each skull, after which it would be covered in clay to fill the men's contours, bumps, and healed injuries. The size of the mouth could be figured out by the distance of the canines, and the nasal spine determined whether a man's nose was, say, upturned or downturned. When available, military records provided hair and eye color. Over the years, their understanding of the crew has changed. The man they originally thought was Collins survived the war, so Collins' remains are only partially identified. And Lumpkin, well, turns out he had a first name, after all. I had just been calling him Lumpkin, like Cher, and then I was like, oh, he has a name now.
So, yeah, Lumpkin has a full name, Cincinnatus Lumpkin, but we do have one crew member that is tentatively named Miller, and just Miller.
So he's the new Cher.
He's our mononym.
We may not know Miller's first name, but names are far from the only way to get information.
So this is his vest, and as you can tell, it's not military. So he is a very interesting character in terms of what he was wearing. His shoes are slightly different than everybody else's, may also indicate civilian rather than military issue. So it kind of just all goes into this mystery of this individual who we can't seem to find in the historical records.
It's a Civil War wool vest from inside the first ever battle submarine.
In 2004, the 3rd crew of the Hunley was laid to rest here in Magnolia Cemetery in Charleston. Thousands of people came out to pay their respect to the Hunley's crew, reenactors dressed in both Confederate and Union uniforms. Noticeably, many of the Southern governors who were invited to attend were absent, citing scheduling conflicts. Rumor is they were understandably wary of being photographed at a giant funeral full of Confederate uniform reenactors.
And now all the men who died in the Hunley, from true Confederate believers to former Union soldiers, black men, Europeans, capitalists and inventors, all lie together under the shade of the palmetto trees.
We want to leave you with a question, something we've all been thinking about while working on this project, and we're very open to your honest feedback. I believe if the Hunley was a Union, northern-built submarine, it would be wildly famous, the names of its crew and builders much better known. Historian Tom Chaffin wrote that the Hunley was a splendid artifact of Victorian-era engineering. At the same time, she was built to sell to the Confederacy, quote, a nationalist movement devoted to the perpetuation of the enslavement of African Americans. An obvious, odious moral position. Can we, or should we, separate art from artist? Or, in this case, naval war machine from inventor? What place should the Hunley have in US and naval history? I'm glad to be back. Thank you, as always, to our patrons who make the ability to focus on these longer documentaries possible. Happy to be once again trying out my sea legs. Hopefully not like the Hunley, because those sea legs are just kind of went straight to the bottom. All of them. So, not really the best metaphor.